All right, well, I'm just going to launch into it now. It's 6:01, so greetings, everyone. This is Hopkins at Home. My name is James Arthur, and we are going to be talking about poetry for the next 3 Mondays. We'll be talking about poetry and different aspects of the poet's craft. And we'll be reading some poems, and I'm going to give you some writing prompts, which I encourage you to try at the end of, well, between this class and next class, and then some more writing prompt. I'll give you more writing prompts after the next 2 classes as well. So if you want, next week, I encourage you to read some of the poems that you've developed in response to the prompts if you'd like, but no one should feel under any pressure to do that either. And we're going to move at a fairly fast pace, but at the same time, don't hesitate to ask questions. If we're going too fast, let me know. It's going to be a pretty casual and fun conversation, I hope, and I hope there'll be lots of give and take. Please, if you please feel free to turn on your cameras and unmute yourselves if you want to say something, so we can make it as much like a real conversation as we can. But of course, also do whatever you feel comfortable with. And let's see here. I'm going to pull up the chat bar. Okay, the chat bar up. All right. I'm going to speak very briefly about a poetic technique called anaphora. And this is whether or not you've encountered the term anaphora before, you've certainly encountered what it describes. An anaphora refers to a rhetorical device and also a poetic device that is the technique of using the same word or the same string of words to begin a number of sentences or phrases in a row, one after another. And so one famous example of anaphora is Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. I have a dream, I have a dream. And then that number of sentences begin that way, but then they end differently each time. And Walt Whitman's poetry famously incorporates a lot of anaphora, and Barack Obama's speeches, many of them incorporated anaphora. And I'm going to talk about this technique, but partly for the sake of just highlighting the technique itself, but also for the sake of talking about a principle that I think really runs through almost all of poetry, which is the idea that a poem, it seems to me, really would, any definition that we have about what makes a poem different from prose is going to, it's a difficult question, and poets and critics argue about it all the time. And if I were to give you any definition of what a poem is or what a poem isn't, we could certainly find a poem that would challenge that definition. But I feel that one of the really essential characteristics of poetry is that in a poem, the language is patterned. And I mean that very broadly. I'm not necessarily talking about rhyme, I'm not necessarily talking about meter, but just that though certainly I am talking about those things as well, that a poem is a piece of writing in which the language is not just being used, the words are not just being used as units of meaning, but they're also constituent elements of a pattern, some kind of structure. It can be a free verse, it's true of free verse as well as metered verse, that one way or another, the poem is setting up a kind of structure. And when you read the poem or when you hear the poem, you encounter that structure. Rhyme's an example of it, alliteration's an example of it, repetition is an example of it. I'm using it right now by repeating the phrase is an example of it over and over again. And so anaphora is that, I think, in a very sort of clear and distilled form, anaphora can give us an example of how poets apply that strategy. And I'll just say, just as a, to sort of launch us on this exploration, I'll just say a few things that uh, with any, you can't, as structure implies repetition, and repetition inevitably opens up the possibility of variation, significant variation. Once you have repetition, you have expectation. Once you're repeating something, then people, your reader or your listener begins to expect the pattern. They begin to see the structure, or they feel that they know where the poem is going, consciously or unconsciously. And then once they begin to feel that way, then you have the possibility of surprising them by doing something different. Even if what you're doing is just giving them the thing they expect in an unexpected way. So let me share a poem with you. This is a poem by Joy Harjo, and I, just give me one moment here, pull up my, She Had Some Horses by Joy Harjo. She had some horses. She had horses who were bodies of sand. She had horses who were maps drawn of blood. She had horses who were skins of ocean water. She had horses who were the blue air of sky. She had horses who were fur and teeth. She had horses who were clay and would break. She had horses who were splintered red cliff. She had some horses. She had horses with eyes of trains. She had horses with full brown thighs. She had horses who laughed too much. She had horses who threw rocks at glass houses. She had horses who licked razor blades. She had some horses. She had horses who danced in their mother's arms. She had horses who thought they were the sun and their bodies shone and burned like stars. She had horses who waltzed nightly on the moon. She had horses who were much too shy and kept quiet in stalls of their own making. She had some horses. She had horses who liked creek stomp dance songs. She had horses who cried in their beer. She had horses who spit at male queens who made them afraid of themselves. She had horses who said they weren't afraid. She had horses who lied. She had horses who told the truth, who were stripped bare of their tongues. She had some horses. She had horses who called themselves horse. She had horses who called themselves spirit and kept their voices secret to themselves. She had horses who had no names. She had horses who had books of names. She had some horses. She had horses who whispered in the dark, who were afraid to speak. She had horses who screamed out of fear of the silence, who carried knives to protect themselves from ghosts. She had horses who waited for destruction. She had horses who waited for resurrection. She had some horses. She had horses who got down on their knees for any savior. She had horses who thought their high price had saved them. She had horses who tried to save her, who climbed in her bed at night and prayed as they raped her. She had some horses. She had horses she loved. She had some horses she hated. These were the same horses. To the poem, as you'll see, there's more to it. There's Harjo has another version of the poem which is considerably longer, in which what we just heard is only the first section. It's true that the poem, uh, these horses, to me, the horses seem like men. I mean,
Yes.
the horses that they spit at male queens who make them afraid of themselves. They climb in her bed at night and pray as they rape her. A lot of these things seem pretty specifically to, it seems to me, to suggest men. Um,
Yes.
and uh, it's true, the poem, uh, some in some of these lines, we're really invited to feel sympathetic to the men when it says that they had, they horses who danced in their mother's arms. She had horses who thought they were the sun, and their bodies shone and burned like stars. She had horses who were much too shy and kept quiet in stalls of their own making. In these moments, we're really being invited to sympathize with these men. But of course, there are other moments where the men are portrayed as being violent or dangerous. And so the poem's not letting us settle into an easy take on it, is it? The poem's giving us this fairly complex portrait of these men and how she feels about these men, if they are men, if that's how we interpret it. Um, and look too at how varied the lines are in terms, the sentences are in terms of their length. We have some sentences that are she had horses who lied, but then we have some that are she had horses who told the truth, who were stripped bare of their tongues. And so the anaphora is coming with this phrase, she had horses who. That gets repeated over and over and over again in almost all the lines, except there's another refrain that's intermittently woven through the poem, which is, she had some horses. But all the lines that begin, she had horses who, notice how Harjo expands and contracts that sentence. And that has an effect on us, doesn't it? When the sentence is long, it can seem kind of ecstatic. When it's short, it can seem very terse and to the point. And that's those lines that I think that um, she had horses who were lying seems very, the brevity of the sentence seems expressive, right? If we take, like, let's say we read the two sentences immediately preceding that, so if you pull up that link there, I'm in the the fourth stanza, the fourth long stanza, the one beginning, she had horses who liked creak, stomp, dance songs. Uh, she had horses who cried in their beer. She had horses who spit at male queens who made them afraid of themselves. She had horses who said they weren't afraid. She had horses who lied. And notice too how there's some of these sentences are obviously operating in relationship to the ones that precede them. And then others are radical changes of subject from the sentences that precede them. So um, if we look at those those three sentences, she had horses who spit at male queens who made them afraid of themselves. We have that theme of fear, right? And it gets continued in the next line. She had horses who said they weren't afraid. She had horses who lied. And that sentence is, well, she had horses who lied, sort of, we're invited to think about that in relationship to the horses saying they weren't afraid. And then the next sentence, she had horses who told the truth, who were stripped bare of their tongues. While then telling the truth is clearly operating in relationship to that line about lying. But then we have um, uh, other moments where the poem just radically changes directions. She had horses who whispered in the dark, who were afraid to speak. She had horses who screamed out of fear of the silence, who carried knives to protect themselves from ghosts. She had horses who waited for destruction. She had horses who waited for resurrection. So notice how there's a kind of power that comes from her having a line that's is inverting or developing a theme that's presented in the line immediately above, but there's also a kind of energetic charge that she gets from what might seem to be a non sequitur. And notice how some of those stanzas are long, some of them are short, like some stanzas might have only 4 sentences beginning, she had horses who, and others might have 6 or 7. I'll move forward quickly because I want to give you a lot to work with here, but just so there's no ambiguity, anaphora is referring to this strategy that she's using of having a number of lines, in this case, begin with the same string of words. And I think the anaphora is doing a number of different things for Harjo in this poem. It's creating this structure. It's inviting us to be sort of lulled by this incantatory rhythm of the poem. But also it's allowing her to free associate. The poem has so many energetic leaps from one subject to another, one tone to another, and the repetition carries us over those leaps, I think, by making all of these, because all of these phrases are kind of in a syntactical parallelism with one another, it makes them seem like they're all unified, no matter how widely the poem's diction and metaphors range. All right, now this is one more example of anaphora, and then we'll look at an example of epistrophe. This poem is called I Would Drive to Your Grave. Maybe I'll read this one aloud just because it's got a few curveballs. It doesn't seem fair to make anyone give a cold reading of this one because, as you'll see, it doesn't have any punctuation.
I Would Drive to Your Grave by Leslie Harrison. I would drive to your grave, but your grave is the crash, the froth, foam pebbles, small rocks, the sand, smoothed, soothed, each rising, each leaving tide, you lie in the ocean, the water in the waves, your home, the stern, the back, the wake of a boat, those curled white lines of leaving. I would visit your grave, but your grave is a single blue afternoon of passing isles, the green and granite shores. I would come to your grave, but your grave is the fire. Oh, mother, it is cold tonight, and I have no heart for this burning, for the fine sift of ash, which is all that comes back, all that comes after. I would visit your house, but your things are missing your touch. As your eyes failed, I brought you lights, and I would see again that brightness. I would drive to your grave, but I am your grave, your marker. O mother, I am your stone.
The square brackets are a particular convention that is often used to indicate that it's not truly a title, but is that the poem's title is it is from the first line. That the poem is now I don't know if that's true in this case. It may be that it may be that Harrison is kind of playing with that convention because that isn't actually the full first line. As you can see, the full first line is I would drive to your grave, but your grave is the crash. But Emily Dickinson's poems, for example, sometimes she didn't title them, but sometimes people, when they're referring to them, will refer to them by having the first line in square brackets. But you're right, the punctuation, the absence of the punctuation is certainly making a difference, isn't it, in terms of how we receive the poem. I'd be very curious to know how it affects the poem for you. And again, it's not a question of what it means in any objective sense, I think, but a question of how it affects your encounter with the poem. What difference would it make to you if the poem were punctuated? Wave-like motion, don't you think? I mean, it suggests the idea of water. And that's, like many of you, I'm sure, my first encounters with poetry were in high school classrooms where I was asked, so what does it mean? What does it signify? And I feel like that's almost never the right question because to ask that is to insist upon one meaning as being certainly true and to foreclose the possibility of all the other things that the poem might suggest to a person. Um, and really, I don't know anybody who writes a poem with the idea that the thing should mean only have only one specific symbolic meaning, and that all other meanings would be false. Um, in some ways, the pleasure of a of a poem, just like the pleasure of just like a movie or a painting or a piece of music, the pleasure of the thing is that it sits in a sort of indeterminate position between all these potential meanings. And so the individual reader, the individual listener, uh, really does produce part of the meaning. It's the meaning's partly a matter of what the poet intended to suggest, but it's partly a matter of how you receive it and the context that you bring to the poem, and whether that context is what you know, what you've experienced, just your mood in the moment that you read it. So I think that, and in some ways, that's right at the heart of what we'll be talking about for the next three classes. I do feel that the subject determines the form, but I think it's equally true to say that the form determines the subject. And that is actually uh, from my perspective, the more the more one is able to allow the form to influence the subject, the more one is really writing it, is really um, um, submitting to the process of writing a poem and allowing the poem to lead a little bit. And what I mean by that is if you are working on a poem and then let's say a rhyme occurs to you and you think, all right, I like the idea of rhyming fine with incline, and I'm gonna find a way to make it work. Well, then if you're doing that, you're gonna end up building sentences that are going to allow you to bring fine and incline into a rhyming relationship with one another. And then at that point, the form really is influencing the subject. It's not just the other way around. Um, and so for me, when a really beautiful poem is one in which the form and subject can't really be unpicked from one another because, or can't be picked apart from one another because they've been so thoroughly and deeply woven together that they're really the same. Notice too how it intensifies in that the third line from the bottom, I would see again that brightness, I would drive to your grave. And I mean, really, if you want to push the point, even the eyes of I brought you lights, I am your grave, I am your stone, all that I coming together so close at the end, but certainly the I would coming twice in a single line. It's, you can feel the anaphora closing up, can't you? Because the interval, which is so long in that first, between the first I would drive to your grave and the second I would drive to your grave, it closes. And what that does, just it's a little bit analogous to what I was talking about in the Harjo poem with the effect of shortening the line. All of a sudden, it's like the pace is picking up because the poem has taught us to listen for the I would, I would, I would. And then when it starts coming faster, it's like the drum is it's like the rhythm is accelerating. There's a very similar effect in if you think about Shakespeare's sonnets, the rhyme scheme of Shakespeare's sonnets. A Shakespearean sonnet, also known as the English sonnet, the rhyme scheme typically is A, B, A, B, but in meaning, in other words, the first line rhymes with the third, and the second rhymes with the fourth. And then that's repeated. That whole structure is repeated two more times. So A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, and then G, G at the end. So the last two lines of a 14-line English sonnet, they rhyme with one another. And up until that point, the rhymes have been two lines apart from one another, but then it gets cinched at the end. So to go back to Joanne's question about the form and the content, the relationship of the form and the content, it's so important in those English sonnets that tighten up. If this be wrong and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved, right? The rhyme tightens up in the end into this epigram and this moment of rhetorical intensity at the end. But you've got to have you've got to have something that's worthy of that rhetorical intensity at the end for it to really be brought home to the reader in a satisfactory way. I would love to keep talking about this poem too, but we should press forward because I want to make sure that I give you a good example of epistrophe as well in our last 15 minutes or so here. So just bear with me one more moment.
House of Beauty by Mark Dodie. In Jersey City, on Tunnelly Avenue, the House of Beauty is burning. On a Sunday morning in January, under the chilly shadow of the Pulaski Skyway, the House of Beauty is burning. Who lobbed the fire bottle through the glass, in among the cremes and thrones, the helmets and clippers and combs? Who set the House of Beauty burning? In the dark recess, beside the sink, where heads lay back to be laved under the perfected heads rode along the walls, the hopeful photographs of possibility darken, now that the House of Beauty is burning. The skyway beetles in the ringing cold, trestle arcing the steel river and warehouses, truck lots and Indian groceries, a new plume of smoke joining the others, billow of dark thought rising from the broken forehead of the House of Beauty. An emission almost too small to notice, just now, the alarm still ringing, the flames new launched on their project of ruining an effort at pleasure, jagged glass jutting like cracked ice in the window frame. All things by nature, wrote Virgil, are ready to get worse. No surprise, then, that the House of Beauty is burning. We do not live here. The fire department's on the way, so we're at leisure to consider motive. Personal enmity, arbitrary malice, a will to pull down the forms of order, hungry for an end, or for equity. If we can't have beauty, you won't have it either. The world as it is, for which Jersey City stands in nicely, torches the houses of beauty wherever it finds them. The House of Beauty is the house of flames.
So this is an example of epistrophe in that the repeated element, the House of Beauty is burning, comes at the end of the stanzas. But notice again, as Andrew pointed out in the case of Leslie Harrison's poem, the refrain's changing a little bit too. It's not that it's clearly we're getting the same essential refrain at the end of each of these stanzas, but it is getting varied a little bit. So that it's a way of for Dodie to keep the poem ahead of our expectations. Well, let me once again, I'll bring that question around to you all. What difference would it make if we didn't have that line? If it says so, the line is at the end of the almost at the end of the second to last stanza. All things by nature, wrote Virgil, are ready to get worse. No surprise then that the House of Beauty is burning. And you're quite right, Joanna. It is anomalous within the poem because the poem has been about a beauty salon, a beauty salon that's been burned down in Jersey City. And then to bring Virgil into it is a rather startling introduction of a different sort of register of diction and of an allusion that might not seem like it would have anything to do with Atlantic City or Jersey City and beauty salons. So what's the effect for you all? What does it do for you? Mark Dodie, by the way, has is famous for having written a lot of poems that are explicitly take up the experience of being gay in America. And he wrote a number of poems that were about, that thematically connected to the AIDS epidemic and about elegies for people who died of AIDS. And so for me too, when I read this poem, something that an association that I always bring to the poem is that though the poem doesn't say as much, I feel like that we're being invited. I always feel that I'm being invited to think of the salon as a place that that's maybe being burned down because its clientele are gay, or because the hairdressers maybe are gay, um, and to suggest that there's an act of intolerance or hatred is that's why that's why I say it, because I feel like it would be hard to know that in this context of just the one poem.
Mm-hmm.
And I put it forward with a little bit of a caveat, which is that maybe it isn't relevant if we're just looking at the poem in isolation,
Mm-hmm.
except that poems do occur in book. A poem after all gets presented in a book, so in the context of the book, it would have all those other poems in there alongside it, which would help shape its meaning. To that point, the ending here where it says, the we do not, if we look at that last stanza again, we do not live here. The fire department is on the way, so we're at leisure to consider motive. Well, Jersey City, is famously a pretty poor city, right? And so we don't live here suggests that the speaker and whoever else is included in that we are people who are just passing through, and their relationship to this is kind of a casual, speculative relationship. And then when we have those lines, 5 lines to 4 lines down, or for equity, if we can't have beauty, you won't have it either. That suggests that, one of the possible motives that's being considered or floated for that's being offered for why this salon has been burned down is that the people burning it down see it as something that is, a kind of, it represents affluence or happiness that's being withheld from them. And so that too enlarges the scope. It's if for a lot of the poem, it's suggested the people who burned down the salon are are the villains of the poem, but then maybe in the last stanza, it's suggesting maybe that's not enough. That maybe that the people who burned down the salon are themselves also um, uh, being oppressed by a larger structure that's in place. At least, again, that's what it seems to imply to me. But we've got only 3 minutes left here, so I want to just offer you a prompt for the next week. And again, no pressure. It's meant to just be fun. So don't fret about it unduly. But I want to suggest that if you do want to try writing a poem between now and next week, that you come up with a phrase, any phrase you want. Try to find something that that isn't too restrictive in terms of what it might mean. So she had horses who, for example, you can imagine ending that sentence in any number of ways. So find some phrase, not a full sentence, but a word or 2 or 3 or 4 words that seem suggestive to you and seem charged with potential in terms of what they might mean, but that also are open enough that you could imagine running with them in any number of directions. You might even want to come up with just brainstorm and come up with a list of like 10 such refrains, just the first ones that come to mind, and write them down on a sheet of paper. And then pick one of them. And then again, just brainstorm and really don't think too deliberately about it. Try to think associatively about it. Take that phrase and just finish the sentence 20, 25, 30 different ways, and try to keep ahead of your own expectations. If you feel like you're making the same point over and over again, or if you feel like if you're stuck in one mood, one register of diction, one theme, switch it up. Make an associative leap and think of and say something that might seem like a complete non sequitur, and allow that to allow that to enter into your piece of writing as well. And then once you've done that, you go as long as you can. Spend 5 minutes, 10 minutes just writing down phrases. And once you've done that, then think about what might be the most interesting and surprising and expressive order to put them in. So reorder them. If the order seems a little predictable or a little staid, then mix it up. And you can add some lines if you want. You can take away some if you think there's some that are duds. But try to see what happens if you move the sentences around from one position to another. And then lastly, and I really think it's important that this be the last thing, give it a title. Why I'm saying it should be the last step is that if you give it a title right at the beginning, you're going to be deciding at the very beginning what your poem's about. And I think that you'll be more satisfied with the results if you defer that decision and allow yourself to just write and free associate and imaginatively riff on your phrase without any particular destination in mind. Robert Frost famously said, no surprise in the writer, no surprise in the reader, by which he meant you have to surprise yourself. And if you don't, if you don't surprise yourself in the act of composition, then the reader's not going to be surprised by anything the poem does either.